All of the music in this concert comes from the so-called Baroque era. That's a period from early in the 17th century to round about the middle of the 18th, just before people like Haydn and Mozart started appearing on the scene. And it's nevertheless an incredibly rich assortment of music. The idea that Baroque music is somehow stylistically standardized, which I can remember people saying to me when I was a boy, is just blown out of the water by the assortment of music that we've got in this concert. It also blows out of the water the idea that there's such a thing simply as a concerto. Nowadays, when we think of a concerto, we tend to think of a work for a solo instrument, usually one, and an orchestra. And that's the way it's been for most of its history, at least for the last 200 years. But before that, as often when forms are new, there was an considerable sense of ferment going on. Well, just as I can imagine in the days when videos first came out, there were competing versions of videos, VHS and all that sort of stuff. So originally, there were two competing ideas of what a concerto could be. And they were centered on two Italian cities that loved nothing better than to compete with each other. One of them was Rome, where Arcangelo Corelli lived, and the other was Venice, where Vivaldi lived. Venice was always very keen to show that it was independent. I mean, the whole idea of Venice as a little city on its own, on stilts in the middle of the sea, gives an indication of how connected with the mainland spiritually it is to start with. But the idea of the concerto that Corelli promoted was an idea called the Concerto Grosso. Now, this isn't like what we think of as a concerto today, because it's not one starry soloist or even a couple of starry soloists versus an orchestra. You'd have an ensemble of soloists, usually 3, maybe even 4, who are kind of part of the orchestra, but who stand out against it. So you're listening to 2 kinds of orchestra playing at the same time, one of them small and, as it were, in your face, and the other one much bigger and broader and richer and more sumptuous in the background. And that is very much the idea behind Corelli's Concerto Grosso. But the Venetian model of the concerto was, as you might expect, much more individualistic. And this was the time of the rise of soloists like Vivaldi, who were great to watch as well as to listen to. And you would be captivated by their antics, their acrobatics at the front of the orchestra, and also a sense of, as it were, almost the soloist taking on the orchestra, even though he or she was a much smaller individual than the largish group assembled behind him. One version, one derivation of the word concerto means to strive, concertare. So the sense of striving with your instrument, but also maybe of striving against the orchestra, which was an idea that was become very popular with the Romantics. Now, Bach, of course, was in an interesting position because he lived in Germany, north of the Alps. So he wasn't caught up in political and cultural rivalries the way that composers like Corelli were. So he could pick and choose. And the 2 works that we have in this concert show him trying out, you might say, the Roman model in one work and the Venetian model in another. The concerto for oboe and violin, even though it's for 2 instruments, is much more in the Venice Vivaldi model. In other words, we have star soloists and an orchestra in the background. And part of the excitement comes in the way that these musicians play off against each other. But the famous Brandenburg concertos, of which we're hearing the 3rd, are much closer to Corelli's idea, the idea of the Concerto Grosso, where actually what we have here is almost an orchestra of soloists. 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, and 1 double bass, and of course a continuo keyboard instrument. They can be soloists, they can be soloists in dialogue with each other within the sections, or they can stand out against the orchestra, or they can make a big, rich sound like a string orchestra. It's kind of like you're looking at something and the perspective is always changing. You're looking into a crowd. One moment you see a crowd, the next moment you see individual faces in that crowd. The next minute you see individual faces, as it were, in dialogue with each other within that crowd. And the way Bach does this is quite phenomenal. It's an incredibly rich sound, not just because it's deep and opulent and delicious and succulent in its own right, because, as I said, so much is happening here on so many levels. It can be like a game of 3-dimensional chess, except that it's a much more enjoyable spectator sport than most games of 3-dimensional chess are. Then we have 2 pieces by Ramo and Purcell, which shows that in this age when the orchestra, the idea of the modern orchestra was beginning to triumph, there were still lots of other uses to which it could be put, because both of these are music to accompany something that's going on the stage. The music from Rameau's Zoroastre, les Boréades and Platée, this is all music from operas. Rameau was an absolute master of the 18th century opera. His operas are incredibly rich and full of character and color and drama. Now, already we begin to change from the slightly sort of static, grand drama of so-called opera seria that had emerged in the earlier part of the Baroque period into something much more fluid and dramatic and interactive and closer to the modern idea of opera, almost to that of Mozart and his comedies. Behind all of these operas is very much the ideas of the Enlightenment, as the later 18th century was called, a period when people began to challenge the idea that you could get your notions of truth in politics or religion, whatever else, from the church or from the opinion of the ruler, but you could find it out for yourself by the power of reason. And also, at this stage, we tend to think of the Freemasons as a rather arcane and mysterious and not exactly constructive group today. But in Rameau's time, the Freemasons were definitely on the left wing. They were challenging all these ideas about received wisdom, and they were promoting, for instance, ideas of universal religion. In other words, not Christianity and the West are superior, but all religions have something to say. All of them have something to tell us about God. And all the music in these three operas of Rameau is inspired by the idea of encountering people from other cultures, which is something absolutely crucial to this kind of mind-expanding process that was going on in Rameau's time. Purcell's suite from the Fairy Queen. How would you describe the Fairy Queen? I had a look on Wikipedia and it called it a semi-opera, which I suppose is about a good guess, because it's kind of half opera. It's kind of a play on the stage with music. It's kind of music with an accompanying play on the stage. In other words, it's kind of not sure, it seems, exactly what kind of piece it is. And yet these periods of ferment, as I said, can often be very exciting in terms of the music they produce. It still amazes me. I think if you asked musicians whether they thought that Purcell was a great and important British composer, most of them would say yes. But if you ask them how much Purcell they actually know, I think you probably find in most cases the answer is not very much. Well, I'm hoping the Fairy Queen music will show you how wrong it is to take that attitude, because Purcell is an extraordinarily rich and inventive and remarkable composer, capable of holding his own against any of the figures in this concert, including even Johann Sebastian Bach. He's that kind of quality. And if he hadn't died at 35, heaven knows what he might have gone on to achieve. But then the whole history of British music might have been different if he'd gone on past 35. Finally, another, in inverted commas, British piece, because it was actually produced by a German composer, but a German composer who very much made his home here, Georg Friedrich, or later George Frederick Handel. This is the Water Music Suite. This was music written for a grand event staged by George I on barges floating on the Thames. Now, the acoustic problems and challenges of trying to play war music on a barge in the middle of the Thames are nightmarish. But it seems to have worked, partly because Handel was able to get barges that could contain sufficiently large numbers of performers. In any case, it worked so well that George demanded that it be replayed not just once, but twice. In other words, it had 3 hearings on that first occasion out there on the River Thames, and it must have been a pretty spectacular experience. And it still is even today in the modern concert hall.